So we're going to take a look at the simulation of the dynamics engine inside Cinema 4D, and it's important to point out that if you're using anything before version 12, that this demonstration is not going to apply to you. The dynamics or simulation engine was completely rewritten for version 12, and version 12 and version 13 use essentially the same simulation engine. As I pointed out in the previous presentation, you get at the content in slightly different ways, but once you get at the content, it's exactly the same. If you're using anything prior to version 12, I would recommend that either you work on this project at Tri-C in the TLC or in the Center for Creative Arts, or you get a hold of version 13. If you're using the demo of version 13, you may run into some limitations in terms of length of renders, but I'll leave that up to you to kind of work out the most appropriate system for this project. Again, I'll be using version 12 to demonstrate this. So as needed, if you're using 13, make sure that you're applying the simulation tags through the tags menu in the object manager. Dynamics can be a lot of fun, very interesting, and relatively easy to use, or easy at least to get started using dynamics. And so we'll take a real quick look at dynamics and how they work. And I'm going to get started by just generating a cube. Okay, and I'm going to use this as a floor plane inside my scene. I could use an actual floor plane, but I want kind of a finite surface here. And I'll call this cube floor. I'm going to introduce a sphere into the equation, and I'll just raise this sphere up a little bit. I'll make it maybe a little smaller, actually just make the floor a little bit bigger. And the idea here is that I want this sphere to bounce across the floor. Now, if we were manually animating this, if we go back and to our memory banks and remind ourselves of what we had to do in order to animate a bouncing ball inside the scene, we'd have to establish some keyframes and deal with the F-curves and deal with spline interpolation and you know, really take into consideration the amount of time that we want to spend animating, how many bounces that we want, and really analyze the animation to make it happen. The advantage of manual animation is that you have all the control you want inside that animation. But if you want to just animate something that's a little bit more random and potentially more technically accurate, you have the ability inside Cinema 4D to simulate something happening. And so the way that we can really quickly just establish a simulation is, in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply two different simulation tags or dynamic tags to these different objects, the floor and the sphere. And in fact, I'm going to call the sphere, I'm going to change that title to ball. Now, I'm going to go under the simulation menu, and I'm going to look under the dynamics tag. And there's primarily a couple of different, there's really 3 or 4 different kinds of dynamic tags that we want to focus on. For now, we're going to focus on just 2. And the first one is create rigid body, and the other one is create collider. Now, if we create a rigid body, now notice that I have the ball selected, and I'm going to create a simulation dynamics, and I'm going to add a rigid body tag to that. The minute I add the rigid body, I end up with a tag that pops up just like any other tags in Cinema 4D. And with that tag selected, we can see what our options are in the attribute manager. Now, right off the bat, if I hit the play button, because I have a rigid body assigned to the ball, it's going to start to simulate. Cinema 4D has within every project a default environment, a default simulation environment, which is activated the minute that you add a rigid body tag, or a collider tag, or a soft body tag, or any kind of dynamics tag. It activates the simulation engine. Now, it's important to note that anytime that you're simulating something in Cinema 4D, that you always want to rewind the playhead to reset the simulation so it starts from the first frame. So anytime we add an element or change something, we want to rewind the playhead and hit play again to test the simulation. There are a whole mess of options that are available in the Attributes Manager, and we'll take a deeper dive into those as we push forward in the presentation. But for now, I really just want to get this ball to interact with the floor. And right now, if I hit play, you'll see that the ball passes straight through the floor. And the reason for that is that the floor does not have a dynamics tag assigned to it. And so if I select the floor and I go to the simulation menu, if I chose dynamics and I chose to create a rigid body, it's not going to give me exactly what I want. And the reason is that when I hit play, both of those objects just start to fall through space. I'm going to rewind the playhead. I'm going to select the floor tag, the dynamics tag, the rigid body tag on the floor, and I'm going to delete that. There's another kind of tag. If I go to the simulation dynamics menu, I can create a collider. Now, a collider is effectively, it's very similar to a rigid body, and I'll choose to add that. The difference is that this is a collider is not affected by gravity. And in addition to that, if I were to take this ball and I hit rewind and I hit play, and I'll pause just before we see the impact here. If I try to move this ball at this point, because it's got a rigid body, Cinema 4D will not let me move this. And that's because Cinema 4D basically owns the motion of this ball the minute that I apply a rigid body. Cinema 4D says, okay, well, I'll take it from here. So whatever you do, I can rewind the playhead to the first frame, and now I can move this thing around. I can change its height. I can do a number of things, but the minute that the playhead starts to move, or I advance the playhead, I don't have the capability to modify a rigid body. A collider, on the other hand, and I'll just rewind the playhead, a collider allows a rigid body to run into... a collider allows the rigid body to run into itself. So in other words, if I've applied a collider on this object, it can collide with rigid body objects. Now, if I hit rewind and hit play again, you can see that my ball starts to bounce. And then towards the end there, it starts to roll, and then my animation restarts. And that's because my simulation is only happening for 90 frames. I'll bump this up to 300 to give it a little bit more room to run and to kind of figure itself out and simulate. But right now, we have a little bit of a bounce going on, and then we eventually start to have a roll that's happening. So we can establish a ball with a rigid body and a floor with a collider tag, and immediately we can establish a very simple interaction. In addition to that, if we go to the rigid body tag and start to look at some of the properties of the tag, we can start to affect things like, if we look under the dynamics tag, we have a couple of properties here. If we go to collision and we focus on bounce, this is how bouncy or how much bounce the ball has. And so if I bump that up to something like, let's say, I don't know, 100%, I'll rewind and hit play, I should see that I get more bounce out of that object. I could also influence the bounce of the floor tag or the collider that's been applied. If I go to collision, it also has a bounce factor, and I can bump up that value, and the two bounce values combine to form the bounciness of this environment, or the bounciness of this collision. So right now I could focus on ball and how bouncy it is. And like in any Cinema 4D field, I could always go beyond 100%, even though 100% might feel like the maximum. I could always key in a higher value. I'll rewind, and hit play, and I should get more and more bounce out of that. So simply creating a bouncing ball becomes a lot easier with the simulation engine, and we'll take a deeper dive into generating some effects with the bouncing ball here in the next presentation. So experiment with the collider object, or the collider tag, and the rigid body tag, and we'll take a look at some of the other tags in the next presentation.